I never had an intuition for plants having consciousness. And I would say that's still the way I tend to intuit it, although my research in this area has now not only gotten me to question, but feel pretty confident that there probably is some level of conscious awareness. But I originally started researching plants because I found it very interesting that there are much more complex behaviors involved in plants than I previously knew about. And then I came to understand that most people, even many scientists, and actually it's interesting that the history is that there was a lot of pseudoscience that was presented that harmed the science. And so it was very hard for people to get funding to do plant research. That has shifted in recent years. So there's a lot of interesting work being done. So I originally was interested in exploring plant behavior because I had an intuition that plants were not conscious. And I found it interesting when I found behaviors that were similar enough that you could kind of place them into the same category of caring for your young, and maybe not necessarily love, because that implies consciousness, but the types of behaviors that I would want to give as an answer, as I said, to that first question. Okay, if I see this behavior in a human being, that seems pretty clear evidence that consciousness is present there. If I see my daughter fall down and skin her knee and she starts crying, she's probably conscious, right?
Probably. Although we can't fully verify, but
we can't verify
could
by
be a
experience.
small humanoid robot zombie.
Exactly. We can talk about that too, and the strangeness of what we'll be facing soon with AI. But yeah, so I thought, okay, if there's a category that I can kind of claim, when that category is expressed in behavior, there is consciousness present. Almost everything you point to, there is an analogous behavior in plants, and it's usually much more simple, and plants don't have brains, and they're very different. But the output, the actual behavior, is not only very similar, but sometimes the mechanism behind the behavior is actually the same. And so I learned from Daniel Shamovitz, the plant biologist, that we all know at this point that we share a lot of our DNA with plants, but some of them are actually the same precursors to a lot of the same types of behavior. So the genes that are responsible for plants' ability to detect light and variation in light, we have those same genes, and they're related to the same processes. They get more complex in human beings and affect our circadian rhythms and all of that. But down to the level of the DNA, this behavior has similarities. And so what I thought was interesting was that I could look at other behaviors that fell into those categories and have no intuition that there's a conscious experience there. And already this started to shift things for me a little bit. So the main reason I've always been interested in plants is because I assume they're not conscious, and that shifts my feeling about when I deem certain behaviors to be evidence of consciousness.
Yeah.
But it also, the deeper you get into this, the more you start to wonder if there is some minimal felt experience. If I can consider there's possibly a minimal felt experience in a worm moving through dirt, plants exhibit very complex behaviors. I can give a few examples of recent ones that I just learned about.
Yeah, with communication, memory.
Yeah, right. All of these things. There's a parasitic vine called a dodder vine, Dodder, dodder vine. This was research that was done in 2023. They were aware, scientists were already aware that dodder vines, the seedlings, when they start to grow, because they don't photosynthesize, they're a parasitic plant, they need to be latched onto another plant in order to survive. So the minute the seedling starts to grow, it starts to sense its environment to find the best plant for it to latch itself onto. There's certain types of plants, like grasses, it can't latch onto at all. They're totally useless. Certain plants are better than others for it to live a long life. And so scientists didn't know that you can watch time-lapse photography of these vines starting to grow, and they kind of move around, and you can tell they're sensing something. And scientists originally thought there was some kind of chemical being emitted by certain plants that they might be able to sense. But it turns out in this case, and plants do detect chemicals, and there's lots of behavior associated with that. But in this case of the dodder vine, one scientist suspected that it had to do with light, that it was actually sensing light, that it had photoreceptors of some kind. So when we look at leaves on a plant, they look green to us because the green light waves are bouncing off. They're not being absorbed, or not as much of them are being absorbed. And that's why we see them as green. But if you could detect the light waves that were going through, or see all the variation of the light waves that were being blocked and bouncing off and those that were going through, which it turns out the daughter vine is able to do, you can see the shape, or maybe see is the wrong word, but you could sense the shape of the leaves and of the entire plant. And so they were finally able to study this in 2023. The assumption was that these daughter vines can detect the types of light waves moving through the plant, and therefore be able to detect the size, distance, location, type of plant it is, and to choose the best plant to latch onto. The experiment just used LED lights, and it mimicked the type of light that would be going through the leaves of a plant that it would be beneficial to attach to, and then a different type of plant like grasses. And it made shapes just with LED lights in the room. And lo and behold, the daughter vine would go toward the LED lights, and these are not plants that are not picking up on chemicals. There's nothing else that they're able to perceive that we know of except for the light. And they move in the direction of the lights that are shaped like the types of plants that would be beneficial to them.
Yeah. Is there any other example in regards to memory that you can think of?
There are many examples of memory. Even simple things like being able to know what season. We all experience spring, and the reason it's not just that the temperature has to be a certain way, but a certain number, depending on the plant. But there are certain plants where a certain number of cold days have to be registered before it will start to switch into this new season of blossoming. I might not have this right, but I believe it's tulips. Is it tulip bulbs? You need to if you put them in the freezer, I think they need to be put in the freezer. They need to have some experience of, I think, 30 days or something like that of cold temperature before they will bloom. And so there's a way in which all plants really, in some sense, are using memory to keep track of, even in a single day, of the sun rising and setting. There are plants, there are house plants that you might notice they're in a slightly different position at a different time of day. They will orient their leaves toward where they're expecting the light to be. And so that, it's a simple form of memory, but then something like the Venus flytrap is actually doing a form of counting. The Venus flytrap has a few hairs on the inside, and it has to be touched. More than one of the hairs has to be touched in succession within a certain time frame to trigger the leaves to close and grab the insect. And so it's keeping track of time and number of hairs being touched, and that is a very simple form of memory. There are also these evolved methods of communication, not just between plants, but between plants and insects. And so there's this whole culture, if you will, of the environment. And there are many examples of this, but one example is a tomato plant. If it's being devoured by caterpillars, first it can sense the caterpillars by the frequency of the chomp. So there's some sense of hearing is maybe not the right way to describe it, but they can detect the frequency. They know the caterpillars have arrived. They release a chemical that signals to the nearby wasps, parasitic wasps, that the caterpillars have arrived, and the wasps come in droves and inject the caterpillars.
Whoa, plant cartel.
Exactly. Yes, and there are many examples of plants summoning insects to help them when they're in trouble. Plants warning other plants of dangerous pathogens that are in the area, and they will use different signals if they're talking to the same species. I'm trying to remember which plant this is that I was just reading about. It might come to me, but there's a plant that sends one chemical if it's trying to let the local same species plant know that there's some kind of invader. It will send a different signal if it wants to let the entire plant community know. Sounds great. I feel like I'm speaking pseudoscience, but you can look this up.
It's real.
Yeah.
It's so fascinating that and you look at densely biodiverse, like the Amazon jungle, or places that have so much variety of plant, bug, animal life. in ways we're barely scratching the surface to understand such large amount of communication, collaboration, supporting, defense that are happening continually.
Yes.
And so how can we best discern whether or not an intelligent life form might possibly have a conscious experience? Like,
Yeah.
I know we kind of established that it's kind of impossible to, but
Yeah, no, I mean,
how do we get to?
I think that, that's why this work is so important. And that's why, consciousness studies are so important, because first of all, neuroscience is really in its infancy. So we're just really barely getting a handle of how the brain works. But no, there's this obstacle, and this is what all my work is about. There's this obstacle to studying consciousness in the way that we have studied other elements, other problems. And it's not clear that we can study it the way we've studied everything else. And I think there is very likely some kind of shift coming in the sciences, similar to when we had these other paradigm shifts. And it's hard to know what that will look like. I have some ideas, but humans in general are not great at foreseeing the future and great at having good enough imaginations to picture what 100 years from now will look like. But I really think that there is some shift coming with the sciences, because I don't see how we can truly understand or study consciousness in the ways that we have studied everything else from the outside.